probably we can say, well, if you do not contribute to the rebuilding of Ukraine, so-called your fraternal cousins, then you will not see a cent of this money. It'll be frozen in perpetuity. I think that's all we can probably do.
Every week we talk to one of the Sunday Times bevy of excellent columnists, and joining us now is Dominic Lawson, who has a column this week. And Dominic, what you're saying, or what you're asking, is a very, very good point indeed. We've seen all the terrible damage to infrastructure being wreaked by Russia on Ukraine, hundreds of millions of pounds, billions of pounds worth of damage. Who's going to pay for it after the war?
That's right, Adam. And it passed almost unnoticed that about 9 days ago, the UN General Assembly voted by a very, very large majority to set up a mechanism for the payment of reparations, obviously by Russia, for the reconstruction, which will have to happen, of Ukraine. But the problem is that Russia, as a member of the Security Council, has a veto. And that means that although the UN General Assembly has set this up, there's no way that they can implement it, and therefore this needs to be pursued by other means.
You got one idea, which is these frozen assets of the Russians could be used.
That's right. Well, it's very complicated, but basically the West, principally America, froze Russian central bank assets that were in mostly dollar accounts, a massive amount, actually, $350 billion. But there is an issue, which is, although certain American politicians are saying, well, we can use this to rebuild Ukraine, the head of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, said this is very dangerous because the Chinese invest in dollars. It's the world's reserve currency. And if they think that when they do something very terrible, that we will essentially expropriate them, then that is a problem for the dollar. But it's a hugely important topic, which hasn't really been discussed very much, which is why I wanted to sort of open the veil a little.
No, I think it's a fascinating column. But I mean, is there a principle on reparations? I mean, we know that after the First World War, the Germans were hit with reparations, which were then subsequently seen to be a mistake. After the Second World War, the Americans particularly actually paid the Germans in terms of the Marshall Plan for reconstruction of the damage done. I don't know what happened after the invasion of Iraq and shock and awe. Did we give did we give the Iraqis money to rebuild?
Well, I mean, the Americans put a huge amount of money into Iraq and indeed Afghanistan. But of course, the Americans claimed that they had a sort of a UN resolution to do with WMD, which turned out not to be there, which mandated it. But what I would say is that after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, actually, where they were defeated, actually the UN set up exactly this. They set up what was called a compensation commission, and $52 billion were paid to compensate Kuwaitis who were invaded by Iraq. And indeed, the irony is that the final installment was paid on the 9th of February this year, and 2 weeks later, Putin invaded Ukraine.
Is there really any chance, assuming that Ukraine is relatively successful in this war, holds onto its territory, establishes itself as an independent nation, is there really any chance that the Russians are going to start shifting across billions of rubles?
I doubt it, but I think what we can do, because we have frozen, the Americans have frozen these assets, is certainly what can be said, and as you say, we don't know how this is going to end, is probably we can say, well, if you do not contribute to the rebuilding of Ukraine, so-called your fraternal cousins, then you will not see a cent of this money. It'll be frozen in perpetuity. I think that's all we can probably do.
It's also worth noting that the Russians have been particularly vicious as far as doing economic damage. I mean, not all wars set out to destroy the infrastructure and the power grid, do they?
That's right. And that's a function of their lack of success in, you might describe as conventional combat, that they've been driven back. And therefore, what they're trying to do is what you could say that the Nazis did in the Blitz, which is to try to demoralize the civilian population. But historically, that has not been a very successful procedure. And indeed, the Second World War did not come to an end because of the devastating bombing that we did on places like Dresden in Germany. That's not what brought the war to an end, and I don't think this will succeed either for the Russians. But it is, as you say, terrible, absolutely terrible. And we have Ukrainian families staying with us. And of course, you can see it's very traumatic to them when they hear that their family doesn't have even water, which means from time to time, which means the sewage is not being treated. They can't cook. The privations are, as you say, terrible.
And just finally, what about us? What about everyone else chipping in? What are the precedents or the likelihoods of that?
Well, there is this European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which I think we have been shareholders in. I'm not quite sure what the situation is now. And that certainly would see this as a project. But the scale is enormous, the scale of damage. And it would just seem odd that if the West were the only people who were actually funding the reconstruction of Ukraine, and the people who are solely responsible for demolishing the infrastructure pay nothing.
Dominic Lawson, thank you for sharing your thoughts this morning. And you can read Dominic's column plus all the other insightful comment pieces in today's Sunday Times by picking up a paper, of course, or you can head online with a digital subscription. And if you do that, you can currently get your first 4 months for just £1.